So the Russian military is currently facing a massive recruitment crisis, causing them to consider some increasingly dramatic and frankly desperate options. Some of their most desperate options of this entire war. That much seems to be understood by most people at this point, at least at a surface level. But it turns out that when you dive deeper, and you really understand the fundamentals behind this recruitment crisis, you realize that the Russians really can't do anything to fix their core problems, even if they try their hardest. Currently, the Ukrainian military is eliminating more Russian soldiers on a daily and a monthly basis than the Russians can actually recruit to replace those losses. And it's been that way for most of 2026, and if anything, it only seems to be increasing. That is a massive problem for the Russians, because even at their peak military strength, they were incapable of achieving their objectives. And now, their military is shrinking in size every single day. For Vladimir Putin, it changes the calculus dramatically. He knows that he cannot win the war or achieve his goals without a dramatic escalation, and so predictably, he is considering exactly that escalation. It is now no longer just rumor, but it is essentially confirmed that the Russians will mobilize up to 500,000 additional men and force them to fight against Ukraine sometime before the end of this year. But the question is, will that actually work? Or will it just cause the Russians more pain and a loss at a deeper cost? I actually think it's the latter, and that's not just speculation or wishful thinking. It comes down to the fundamentals of Russia's problems, and why simply throwing more men at the war cannot fix those. And we can understand this most intimately, not by looking at Russia's recruitment crisis as a whole, although we will, but by zooming in briefly to look at one specific area where Russia's recruitment crisis is arguably the worst. Now, if you follow the channel regularly, you can obviously see that I touch on a lot of hot-button issues. And naturally, people are constantly disagreeing with me. Because of that, I find it incredibly important to base my analysis on a factual foundation. Not just for my own integrity, but also for my own sanity, so that I know why I believe what I believe when I'm inevitably challenged. I have a tool that I use that helps me prepare for this, and that tool is Ground News, a longtime sponsor of this channel. What Ground News does is they bring together articles from across the political spectrum for any given topic all in one place. But they do a whole lot more than that too. For each given article, or source of an article, they identify whether that source has a political bias, how factual they're known to be, and also who funds the source, which can sometimes tell you the reason for a potential bias. One thing I really like in Ground News is the bias summary at the top of every subject, which basically reads the articles for you and identifies the competing narratives, if there are any, before you even dive in. This is super helpful because it actually reads a lot more articles than you can and identifies things that you might miss on your own. Before I record a video, I always try to cross-reference on Ground News to make sure I'm being fair to every side, even if I disagree with them. And I personally think the world would be a much better place if more people took that approach. If you want to check out Ground News for yourself, because they're a sponsor of the channel, you can actually get a 40% discount on their Vantage plan by subscribing using my link or the QR code on screen. And that Vantage plan is the same plan that I use to get access to all of their best features. So go check it out, and now back to the video. When we think about Russian military recruitment, the conversation most typically centers around total force size, and for obvious reasons. That's a concept that's easy to grasp, and even there, the Russians are doing terribly. Just compare how many Russians are entering the military to how many are being eliminated, and you realize the Russians just can't keep up. But it turns out that that is only part of the picture, and it is actually far from the most important part. Far more important are not the number of men on meatwave assaults who haven't accomplished anything for literally years. But what's actually more important are the technical experts in the Russian military, the ones who, on an increasing basis, are responsible for the very few results that the Russians actually achieve. And when we look there specifically, we realize a very dismal picture. Not one that's just worse than the overall trend, but that is dramatically worse, to the point that Russia's entire war effort seems unsustainable on a timeline that seems far quicker than most people are actually estimating. You see, for the average Russian soldier, recruitment is rather easy. If you just want to send somebody on an assault and you don't really care whether they survive that assault, all you have to do is offer them a large salary and offer them an area behind the rear where they will have a safe position. Once they signed the contract, that's all said and done. It was easy to get them to sign, and then you just send them on an assault anyways. And this is how Russia has filled the ranks, at least for several years, although those tactics aren't keeping up. That appeals to a certain kind of person, though. That appeals to a person who is desperate, or just frankly speaking, a person who maybe hasn't really considered the situation all that much, and may not be the best candidate for certain types of positions in the first place. You can do that to fill the rank and file positions, but even in the Russian military, for positions that require competence and intelligence and actual technical skill, it's not that easy. You actually have to convince people to join, and you have to get them to join of their own volition. Because you cannot force a technical expert to do a good job, the same way that you can force somebody with a gun at their back to go and charge an enemy position. And this is now the problem that the Russian military is specifically having. Because when we look at their Unmanned Systems Forces, a new division that Russia is trying and failing to create to counter Ukraine's growing technological expertise, we realize that Russia has already run out of their most important resource, which is technically competent, proficient men who are actually willing and able to serve. You see, Russia recently created a new organizational function within their military, the Unmanned Systems Forces. This would be corollary, for example, to how you have the infantry organization or the artillery organization. They work together with specific functions. And the Unmanned Systems Forces, as the name implies, are responsible for the unmanned drones. Critically, the most important aspect of this entire war. The reason they did this was rock solid. The Ukrainians are growing in technical expertise, and Russia needs a specific focus area to ensure that they can continue to counter that, to ensure that they have experts always available along the front lines to continue flying drones against Ukrainian positions and protecting their infantry. The problem is, the reality didn't work out nearly like the theory. Russia set a goal for 2026 to recruit 78,800 men for their Unmanned Systems Forces. But it turns out that at this point in the year, we recently got an update that you can listen to in the words of a Russian deputy defense minister himself, that they've only recruited 8,000. And that's out of a number that at the time he made that announcement should have been closer to 34,400. That is not just a little bit of missing your target. That is entirely missing your target, where your new unit that is supposed to carry the weight of most of your military literally cannot even function except for in limited areas. But it turns out the problem's even bigger than it looks, but I'll get there in just a second. Now, the reason they fell so short on recruitment is because unlike other branches of the Russian military, you can't just shove anybody into these roles. You need to have a base level of competence. And so the Russians were trying to recruit from their universities. This is where you have people getting an education, and also a lot of young people who, yes, a lot of the times are experts at video games, which it turns out is pretty good training for drone warfare. Often, people who are good at video games are the same people who make good drone pilots. The Russians were looking in the right place. The problem is that when the Russians tried to recruit from this pool of people, the pool of people who had a little bit of above average education, they did not want to join. Now, to be clear, this is an area where the Russian recruitment machine still gets an A for effort, because when it came to trying to fill these unmanned systems forces, they tried all the tried and true tactics in this context. They had all the typical propaganda: serve your country, look like an action hero, make a lot of money, it's not actually that dangerous, all that sort of messaging. And they also had the threats where needed to try to push people into joining. Maybe threats of expulsion, or maybe threats of other kinds of punishment if the school didn't get you to sign up so that they could meet their quota. The pressure was there, the incentives were there. It just didn't work. Because this class of people in Russia, they don't care how much you threaten them. They understand exactly what's going on. And they're not willing to put their lives on the line for any amount of money, or for any amount of glory, or anything of that sort. And we can even speculate that among these more educated Russians, there's probably a lot more of them who actually doubt the war goals in the first place and doubt the Russian propaganda in the first place. Whatever the reasons, the efforts didn't work. The technical experts with the education to fill these roles are not as compliant and not as complacent as the Russian military has become used to. And it actually shows you how disadvantaged Russia really is for the rest of this war, where even if they can meet their recruitment numbers on paper, which they can't, that is not the same thing as actually filling the roles that are actually needed to help Russia win this war. As bad as all of that is, though, it turns out that when you look deeper, the problem for the Russians is even worse than it looks on the surface. And if anything, I've made things sound rather rosy and rather comforting compared to what reality actually is. In fact, for now, we can just go back to that tried and true phrase about Russian history, which can be summed up in these words. And then things got worse. That's much the same about these unmanned systems forces when we look at the actual numbers they are achieving and where a lot of those numbers are actually coming from. You see, when the unmanned systems forces grow, it sounds like they're getting net new technical experts that the Russian military desperately needs. And even then, as we said, they're not getting nearly enough. But in a lot of cases, that's not even what's happening. Because to make their numbers look better on paper, we are seeing Russian soldiers being taken from the front lines who actually had expertise in drone warfare, and they're being assigned to the unmanned systems forces instead, so that some minister or general or whoever can make their quotas look a little better. Which means a lot of the numbers we're actually seeing aren't adding any capability to the Russian military. Instead, we're actually sabotaging and detracting from current capability, where right now it is desperately needed. Russia can make itself look somewhat stronger on paper, where they're already failing to do that, at the cost of making their military in reality functionally worse. This is far from the only example of this. We've seen this throughout the Russian military throughout the entire war. There's a reason they are where they are today instead of occupying Kyiv. But anyways, you get the point. As good as things might look for the Russians, it's not even that good. And that's when you really realize how terribly this war is going for the Russians. These unmanned systems forces are not going to get magically filled even if Russia mobilizes millions of more Russians for the war effort. In fact, there's a reason why their recruitment is falling so short in the first place, because you cannot just throw anybody into these positions. It's not a position where any warm body will do. And just forcing people to fight will not magically give them the skills that they actually need to defeat the Ukrainians. This is where you realize how bad the things actually are for the Russians. Right now, the Russians continue to do some pain to the Ukrainians, to do some damage to the Ukrainians, because they do have some drone experts in their military, and they are working hard and they are very skilled. The problem is that Russia seems to have peaked at their skill level, at their capacity for actually recruiting more of those men, meaning that their actual capabilities that actually make a difference, the capabilities that hold the Ukrainians back and allow the infantry to push in as much as the infantry has, which isn't much, those capabilities are diminishing at the exact same time that the Ukrainians are growing in capability more than ever before. Sure, both sides have a manpower problem, but the Ukrainians don't spend manpower the way that the Russians do. The Ukrainians are actually focused on using their intelligent population, their young, innovative population that can figure out how to do things like pilot drones and create new drone innovations. And so we increasingly see the Ukrainians bringing new tech to the battlefield, because in Ukrainian society, while it's not perfect, the incentive structure is there for people to want to figure out how to fight in the way that they can actually fight the best that they can, not just the way that their commander told them to. And so there's actually a disconnect when we compare the Russian military to the Ukrainian military, because the Russian military is not fighting just the Ukrainian military. The Russian military is fighting the Ukrainian military, plus all of Ukrainian society behind that military that is innovating in drones. On the Russian side, we don't see nearly as much innovation. We mostly see them copying, reverse engineering things that the Ukrainians do, which means they're always behind. And now we see even their ability to do that is going to get worse going forward, because they cannot recruit enough technical experts who actually want to fight Putin's war for him. Now, this is, of course, like everything else in this war, a problem that the Russians have created for themselves. But when you really think about this, it's incredibly interesting. Early in this war, Russia broke trust with its citizens by forcing people to fight with deceptive contracts, for example. They told them they would serve in rear areas, and they ended up on the front lines anyways. Because what Russia thought it needed was enough bodies to throw at Ukraine so that they could overwhelm Ukraine quickly, and they thought that Ukraine would collapse. Now that that hasn't happened, this tactic is completely backfiring. Because it turns out that there is actually a legitimate area where the Russian offer is probably genuine. When Russia tries to recruit somebody for their Unmanned Systems Forces, they are probably very unlikely to end up on a meat wave assault, because they actually need their intelligence and their expertise. The problem is the students they're trying to recruit, they don't believe those promises, because so many people in Russia have been lied to, and you would have to be pretty dumb to believe a liar. This is a big problem. Russia can no longer tell the truth because they have lied so much. And so they are really just out of luck in using any traditional normal tactics to actually recruit sufficient technical experts for their military. That's down the drain. And Russia's kind of increasingly acknowledging that. So what else can they do? How else can they fill their military to fight against Ukraine? Well, let's just try more of the same tactic that's already failed. We've seen a lot of changes in Russian society lately, where there's been new laws passed and things of that sort, to try to get more people in the Russian military who haven't been convinced by the last wave of massive propaganda and false promises. For example, we've seen more debt relief being offered to people who join the Russian military. So Russia's trying to find the most desperate people in their society more than ever before, saying, hey, join the military to get rid of your debts because there's no other way that you'll get out of your debts. We've also seen new laws allowing the Russian military to recruit, for example, classes of criminals that even they themselves have typically been unwilling to recruit. Russia has always recruited men from prisons to fill its ranks, but there's certain people that even they wouldn't touch. Now they're touching them. These are people like organized crime experts, people who served in that area, even people who did things as serious as trying to smuggle nuclear material out of the country. Now, even these people are able to be recruited by the Russian military to get rid of their prison sentences. I think the idea here is pretty simple. We can't recruit normal people who are intelligent to join our military, so we have to find people with some level of intelligence somewhere. So let's go for the more sophisticated type of criminal that we've been afraid of, and let's throw them in the military as well now. That is terribly desperate, and it will obviously backfire, and it will obviously not work, but it might get Russia just a little bit further down the line, which has basically been the motif for this entire war. Russia is also turning again to the North Koreans, and we're now seeing reports from Zelensky of Ukraine saying that according to Ukrainian intelligence, Russia is going to recruit 30,000 more North Korean soldiers. 30,000 is like a drop in the bucket compared to Russia's losses, but again, they're tapping into every resource they possibly can. And then, of course, there is this mobilization that Putin himself has long dreaded, that Russia is finally caving into. But this is far from a solution. First of all, as I've already said, Russia has been unable to achieve their war aims, even with people who willingly join the military. Now they're going to try to get a lot of Russian men who have avoided joining the military for over 4 years, and they're going to force a gun into their hands. There's obvious reasons this could backfire, obvious reasons Vladimir Putin has been afraid of this, and why he has prepared for this with information control across Russian society. It remains to be seen if that would even be enough. But the Ukrainians are also not just lying down and waiting for this to happen. Right now they have the initiative, and they are preparing the ground for Russian mobilization in the best possible ways. They're right now targeting Wildberries facilities all across Russia, which are a main source of equipment for the Russian military, because most Russian soldiers have to fundraise for the vast majority of their military equipment. And when it's fundraised, it has to be purchased by civilians on civilian markets. Essentially, Ukraine is taking out Russia's ability to supply their soldiers with equipment at the time that Russia is preparing for their biggest influx of soldiers at one time ever. That means a lot of those guys, maybe the majority, are going to arrive at the front lines in Ukraine without the necessary tools to actually fight in the first place. And even soldiers who have the tools aren't very successful against Ukraine, because it's just not that kind of war. But of course, you'd rather have the tools than not, and Ukraine is currently systematically denying the Russians of those tools. At the same time, Ukraine seems to be creating kind of a buffer zone. For example, and I've created a whole video on this, Ukraine is really softening up targets around the border, like in the Belgorod region. They're really working hard, it seems, to get civilians to leave those areas and to deny those areas of fuel and electricity, just as they have done for the Crimean Peninsula. So as Russian soldiers arrive to potentially threaten the Ukrainian front, Ukraine will have the ability, like never before, to prevent them from being successful even before they reach the front lines. There's also a very important difference between Ukraine of today and the Ukraine of a couple of years ago when Russia did their last mobilization wave. At the time Russia did their last mobilization, Ukraine's hands were still tied behind their backs. They were getting most of their advanced weaponry from their foreign partners, and those foreign partners did not want Ukraine to fire that weaponry onto Russian territory. That meant Ukraine could see massive accumulations of resources and men, but they couldn't do anything about it. Now that's different. Ukraine has all of their own homegrown capabilities, and their partners that are providing weapons don't really seem to have the same reservations about Ukraine using those against Russian targets on Russian territory anymore. That means that Ukraine can increasingly disrupt training exercises, massive accumulations of men preparing for offensives, and things of that sort like never before. So Russia is trying a same strategy that has already failed, and they're doing it under worse circumstances for their own country, while their enemy has more capabilities than ever before. Again, this is a difference between two systems, between two societies, between two forms of leadership and how those forms of leadership lead you to fight a war. And one of those systems is clearly superior, even though when the war started, they were at a disadvantage. I would compare this, it's not a perfect analogy, but I'd compare this, for example, if you've ever played a strategy game that has different areas and ages of soldiers and warfare. One time you're attacked by an enemy that's maybe an era above you, but because they think that they have the advantage, they try to claim victory. And while they're investing all their resources in their military, you're investing resources, for example, in science and development. And they think they're still fighting the war of yesterday, but you have quietly upgraded your forces to where now one of your units can take out 10, 20 of theirs without even breaking a sweat. That is precisely what's happening with Ukraine right now. Ukraine is not the same military of 4 years ago. They're not even the same military of 2 years ago or of 1 year ago. Ukraine is a brand new military with more capabilities than ever before. And they are capable of easily, in my opinion, defeating anything that the Russians can throw at them in terms of human soldiers. Even if Ukraine gets pushed back a little bit, at this point they have well-prepared defensive lines, and they can do strategic retreats, strategic withdrawals, which Russia should understand because historically that's been part of their strength, to areas that are more fortified so that even if they lose a little bit of territory, the Russians can't achieve a victory by doing what they're currently doing. This is a desperate strategy. This is a desperate move by the Russians. But they're doing it because they have no levers left to pull, no strings left to pull. This is why Ukraine will ultimately be victorious. And this is why I don't really worry about Ukraine in the long term. If anything, I worry more about Russian citizens who are forced to fight against their will and end up being annihilated by their own government. But I also recognize that because they're part of that society and because they've supported that system, unfortunately, this is the consequence. And so you have to weight that in as well. In either case, I am more confident than ever that Ukraine will be victorious, no matter what the Russians do. Now, if you learned something new in this video, please do me a favor by liking the video and subscribing to the channel, which will ensure that you'll see more videos just like this one in the future. If you enjoy my work, consider becoming a patron or a YouTube channel member which supports the channel and keeps me going producing videos like this one. Finally, before you go, don't forget to check out ground news for yourself at ground.news/Paul and use my code to get a 40% discount off their Vantage plan. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you on the next one.